applicants who are planning to apply in the next cycle, due date in January or perhaps later in the year. We will not focus heavily on general SBIR and STTR policy today, but I will point you to some of those resources. Instead, we're really going to focus on the NINDS specifics. I'm going to start just by introducing you to our wonderful team at the NINDS Small Business Program. I'm joined today by several team members. First off, I'll introduce Dr. Natalie Trzynski, who's a scientific project manager in our program. Dr. Trzynski is the program officer on roughly half of our small business portfolio and also one of the most knowledgeable people at NIH regarding NINDS small business policy and procedures. She'll also be acting as the moderator for today's Q&A session. Please say hello, Natalie. Sarah Dauber is here as well. She is our strategic business consultant who joined our team last spring. She brings a wealth of biotechnology business development experience to our team, so please say hello. Dr. Sarah Robinson Schwartz is also joining us. She is a AAAS fellow who joined our team in August. Dr. Robinson Schwartz is working closely with our portfolio, and she also leads NINDS participation in the Applicant Assistance Program, which I'll talk about a little bit more today. Our program also includes two team members from the Translational Neural Devices Program, who we have stolen and are holding captive. Just kidding. That includes Dr. Eric Kudak, who's a scientific project manager who oversees our small business portfolio in the pain space and is also a wealth of information when it comes to device development more broadly. Thank you for joining, Eric. In addition, Dr. Sid Shenoy from the devices team supports our program and the small business pain portfolio as a scientific program analyst. Natasha Davis is our fantastic operations coordinator, who many of you may know if you've contacted us in the past, likely recognize her name. And then finally, we have Tim Leiden joining us as well, an operations coordinator and our communications guru in the Division of Translational Research, who's assisting us today in this webinar. A few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be posted on our NINDS Small Business Program website. A PDF of these slides with the embedded links will be emailed to all registered attendees. So don't worry, you'll see a lot of hyperlinks to resources in the slides. You will be able to access those in the PDF. If you have technical issues today, we're going to ask you to please use the chat box, and Tim will be happy to help make sure those technical issues are addressed. If you have questions that you would like our team to discuss in this discussion today, please use the Q&A box to post those questions. Natalie will be collecting those questions and we'll be addressing them in Q&A after we go through the information. You can enter those questions at any time during the presentation or the Q&A. Okay, go ahead and get started. So first off, what does program staff mean? What does our team do? Our role is in developing funding opportunities and announcements, in helping applicants understand what the NINDS mission is, where their project fits in our mission, what funding opportunities make the most sense. We are a resource to understand policies and procedures for NINDS funding, NIH funding, SBIR and STTR funding, and we play a role in transitioning applications from the review phase to the funding recommendation phase. In addition, applicants may interact with the NIH Center for Scientific Review, who's responsible for applications assignment to different institutes for reviewing compliance. So evaluating whether the application is eligible to continue on to review. They are the ones to determine whether an applicant qualifies for late submission. And the Center for Scientific Review is also going to be responsible for assigning your application to a specific review group and assigning particular reviewers to your application. By design, the Center for Scientific Review and the review process is kept very separate from program. We as program staff do not play a role in the assignment of your application to individual reviewers, to review groups, or really where in reviewing the compliance of your application to the requirements. In addition, when it comes to the mechanics of applying, the ERA service desk is going to be your best resource. Program, we are really not the best resource to help you with any errors you're getting when you're in the process of applying, issues with checking your application status through ERA. Those kinds of questions are going to be best serviced by the ERA help desk. So what can we do as program staff? What do we help you with? The first step that you're going to want to do when you're thinking about getting funding from NINDS Small Business Program is see whether or not your business is eligible. The link provided here will direct you to the main NIH SBIR website where the eligibility information is available in full detail. But some quick highlights from the eligibility information is that the small business needs to be US owned and operated. It needs to be a for-profit organization, and there can be no more than 500 employees. There are some there's some pretty detailed language about the ownership requirements that's available on the website. It's definitely a first step is just making sure that your small business concern is going to qualify for SBIR funding. The next thing you want to do is begin the registration process. There are 5 registrations that your small business is required to go through before you can apply. The one that takes the longest here is the SAM registration. It can take 4 to 6 weeks itself. When you add in the other registrations, you want to make sure you're allowing about 6 to 8 weeks from the time you start this process before you would apply. So for those of you planning to apply at the January 5th due date for SBIR and STTRs, now is the time to make sure you have started that registration process. Next, I would highly recommend reviewing the main NIH SBIR website, which has a wealth of resources. This is sbir.nih.gov and is linked here. Specifically, you're going to find a lot of information about the phases of SBIR and STTR funding and the different mechanisms available. You'll see sample applications that can be incredibly helpful when it comes to figuring out the kind of content that reviewers might be looking for in your application. There's information on funding timelines, on review information, and there's an extremely helpful and detailed FAQ section that I absolutely recommend reviewing. Next, you're going to want to determine your target application date. As I've mentioned, the SBIR and STTR programs at NIH have standard due dates. These are January 5th, April 5th, and September 5th. Almost all of the funding opportunities fall on or very close to these dates. And you'll see below the typical timeline to get through the application process onto funding for each of these submission dates. The process typically takes about 6 to 8 months, depending on exactly when the review meeting is, when the council meeting is, and how long it takes to actually get the award out. The next step is determining whether your project is indeed a fit for NINDS specifically. There are 27 institutes and centers at NIH with different missions. Neuroscience is itself supported by several institutes and centers at NIH. NINDS specifically is focused on neurological indications. So this includes stroke, neurogenetic disorders, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, neurodegenerative disorders like MS, ALS, and PD, and many forms of pain. You can take a look at our website at all the indications that fall under the NINDS mission space to see whether or not your project would likely come to us. You can also use the NIH reporter tool, which is linked here, where you can enter information about your project and see similar projects that have been funded. You can also see which institutes have funded those similar projects. And that'll at least help you narrow down the possible institutes that your project would be best fit with. At NINDS, we fund small businesses specifically through the SBIR and STTR set aside about $77 million annually. This funding goes to a broad scope of projects that cover therapeutics, diagnostics, research tools, biomarkers, devices, small molecules, biologics, digital health and software should be there as well. That's in our, we fund that as well. And also we fund a broad range of translational R&D activities. That is everything from very early phase drug discovery and device prototyping through early stage clinical trials. Some of the questions we often get on mission fit, platform technologies. So oftentimes people will come to us, you know, we have a technology or a small molecule that we think will apply to many different indications. NINDS tends to look for projects that are primarily focused in neurological indications. There are some institutes and centers that support platform technologies and approaches. That includes places like NCATS, NIBIB, but also we would likely want to ask you that it may, if your product will actually be on the market as a platform technology, or if you're going to go on the market to different indications. If you're going to be an FDA approved therapeutic, for instance, even if that therapeutic could potentially be used for many different indications, you'll likely need to have a first to market indication approved. And so in those cases, we would likely advise you to focus on that first to market indication and find the institute that best fits that first to market indication. For applicants who have found a really interesting funding opportunity announcement that seems to fit their project and want to know if we can fund it, we can only fund applications that come into funding opportunity announcements that we participate in as an institute. You'll see right at the beginning of funding opportunity announcements a list of the institutes that participate in that announcement, and you want to make sure that NINDS is featured there. If you don't see NINDS listed, you can also check to see if there are notices that indicate that other institutes have signed on. Or you could also just make sure that it's the most up-to-date issuance of that funding opportunity, which you can check by looking at the expiration date. And there's typically a link to any new issues of a funding opportunity. Will my project be assigned to NINDS? Not necessarily. It's going to be assigned to the institute that best fits your project of the institutes that participate in that FOA. So again, your application is going to go through the Division of Receipt and Referral, and they will review your project and help to determine the institute that has the best fit. You can request a specific institute for your project in your cover page. However, if the Division of Receipt and Referral really feels that that institute is not a fit for your project in terms of mission, it may not be assigned to that specific institute. The next step is identifying a target funding opportunity announcement. And here on this slide, I'm showing you the funding opportunities that our program, the NINDS Small Business Program, participate in. So these are all funding opportunities that are specific to small businesses and that NINDS participates in. The first and really the funding opportunity that we get the vast majority of our applications in from is the Omnibus. This Omnibus is meant for investigator-initiated projects. There's no specific aspects of the scope. It's not just for devices or biologics. It's for everything that could come into NIH and broader in HHS. NINDS specifically accepts non-clinical trial applications to the Omnibus. This includes phase 1, phase 2, direct to phase 2, and fast track applications. In addition, NINDS participates in several funding opportunity announcements that have a specific technical focus or are part of a specific initiative. One of these is focused on research tool development, which is through the BRAIN initiative. A second is focused on pain management and is part of the HEAL initiative. And a third is focused on Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease related dementia. Finally, we have several funding opportunities for later stage activities. For exploratory clinical trials, NINDS has our own funding opportunity announcement We do not fund, as I mentioned, clinical trials through the omnibus. Some other institutes do. For NINDS, clinical trials primarily come in through our exploratory clinical trial funding opportunity announcement. Phase 2B SBIRs, or bridge awards, as they may be referred to in other institutes, are meant for companies, or are only eligible to companies who have been awarded a Phase 2 SBIR or STTR from NIH. And in that opportunity, we allow both preclinical, clinical research, and clinical trials. And then finally, our program does participate in the commercialization readiness pilot. This is another funding opportunity that is specifically available to companies that have received a Phase 2 SBIR or STTR award. And this particular mechanism is open or allows for a range of not just research and development activities, but broader commercialization assistance activities. Most of these opportunities have standard SBIR and STTR due dates or are very close, with the next date being January 5th, 2021. And another reminder to carefully read the funding solicitation and make sure that you're addressing all of the requirements. And I'm going to break down some of the frequently asked questions by topic area for each of these. So I know that was a lot of information. One of the first determinations a company needs to make in an application is whether they're coming in to an SBIR or an STTR mechanism. The differences can really be summed up here. So the actual project scope, the budget, the timeline, those things are not going to change between SBIR and STTR, but there are some key differences in what's required. First is affects whether or not there can be a nonprofit research institute partner, such as a university. In an SBIR, this is allowed. It is not required, but you can have a university partner. In an STTR, this is required. An STTR is required to have a partner. The award still goes to the small business, but a university or other nonprofit research institution based in the US must be a partner in the application. A second difference is the work requirement and outsourcing requirements for the small business. In an SBIR, a small business may outsource up to 33% of Phase 1 activities and up to 50% of Phase 2 activities. This is determined by the total budget. I will note that at NINDS, we do allow flexibility in Phase 1, in that Phase 1 work requirement, and that we will allow businesses to outsource less than half of the award, but they can exceed 33% typically. For STTR, at least 40% of the work should be conducted by the eligible small business, and at least 30% must be done by a nonprofit US research institution like a university. There are not exceptions to this requirement. Finally, the PI requirement is important to note as well. For an SBIR, the PI must be primarily employed by the small business. In an STTR, the PI can be primarily employed by the small business or by the partner research institute. This can be an important factor that affects some companies and where they're going to apply. If it's really important that the PI be an academic investigator, really want to take a look at the STTR mechanism, which would allow that. As far as specific questions we get here, there's often a question about what does primary employment mean? Can I be the PI on an SBIR if I'm an academic investigator, but I'm also going to work at the small business, more than half-time or even full-time? Generally, no. That would not count as primary employment if you have a full-time position in addition to your role on the small business. As a note, there is no requirement of your affiliation as in the role of an MPI, a multi-PI, or a co-I, or other roles. So it is possible to bring in on an SBIR a multi-PI who is an academic investigator, or a co-investigator who's an academic affiliated individual, but they cannot be the contact PI on an SBIR. When determining mechanism, there are a few things to think about. So is your project ready for Phase 1, Phase 2? Should you pursue a fast track? I'll go over some of those key differences. The first thing to think about is the development stage. Phase 1 is meant for proof of concept and feasibility. What this means really varies by project. There's not a one-size-fits-all definition of feasibility, especially when we're thinking of all the projects that could come in across NIH. What we often see are things like an efficacy demonstration of a prototype device or of a small molecule, but sometimes that's even going to be farther away, and people are doing earlier stage work than that, and sometimes they're doing later stage work. It really depends on your specific project, and you can ask us our thoughts on that when you send us your specific aims page. Phase 2 is meant to, it's again, very broad pre-commercial R&D. So once you've moved past the point of feasibility or proof of concept, and you're in your kind of pre-commercial R&D phases, that can be supported by Phase 2. And Fast Track is a mechanism that allows you to apply for both Phase 1 and Phase 2 components of a project in a single application. Commercialization plan is a 12 pages of an application. It is not required in Phase 1 applications, but it is required in Phase 2 and Fast Track applications. It's another important thing to be considering as a company. Are you in a position where you have a solid sense of how you're going to go to market, of your IP plan, of your fundraising plan, of your competitors and your advantages over competitors? If you're feeling like you're just starting out and your project is maybe not very far along, a Phase 1 is probably the right place to start. I'll go through some of these frequently asked questions. So as I talked about, when you should consider determining Phase 1 or Phase 2 has to do with the stage of development, the amount and quality of your preliminary data, and then your company readiness. Are you ready to put forward a strong commercialization plan? Should I address commercialization potential in a Phase 1 proposal, especially as I just said, there's no commercialization plan required in a Phase 1? Yes. So even though there is no commercialization plan section, reviewers will comment and are allowed to comment on the commercial potential of your product. So it is important to address things that in your product might be particular risk factors in commercialization. For instance, this often means things like, is it patentable? It may be okay that you don't yet have a patent issued on your technology if you're in an early stage, but what is your strategy to protect that? Where are you currently in that process? Market size might be a potential issue. So if you're working in a small market space, speaking to how you'll be successful in commercializing may be important. Specific advantages over other competitors may be something to address. And any other factors that in your specific case you think may be a question as far as, can this be commercialized? Is this a commercializable product? The where you can put that in your application may vary depending on information. The significance section is often somewhere that applicants are advised to discuss these aspects. Is my project right for a fast track mechanism application? So we often get a lot of applicants who would like to pursue fast track applications. The advantage being that if you get a fast track award, once you, whether and if you meet your Phase 1 milestones, if that happens, you can then get your Phase 2 award right away instead of having to go through another application process. However, there are some things to be mindful of that you should think about because they may be necessary to be a competitive fast track award. So the first is your project such that you have a very clear defined first phase proof of concept that has very clear go, no-go milestones that are quantifiable that will differentiate those two phases. The second is it clear right now what you're going to be doing in Phase 2? Or is it the case that your Phase 1 activities are going to be dictating what happens in Phase 2? If the latter, a fast track is probably not right for you. With a fast track award, there is not flexibility in the scope of what's being funded in Phase 2. So if you're doing, for instance, an exploring a bunch of different designs of a prototype, say, it may not be appropriate to propose a fast track because what you're doing in that second phase is going to be highly dependent upon the outcomes of that first phase. And then lastly, thinking about the commercialization plan readiness from a company perspective. If that you don't think that's going to be a very strong piece of the application, you may want to come in as a phase 1. There are a number of programs at NIH that we have that are designed to help companies strengthen their commercialization plan. These include programs like I-Core and C3I, which I won't go into detail in today, but are available to awarded companies that are specifically meant to help strengthen that commercialization plan so that you can have a strong phase 2 application. I have a phase 1 award. When can I apply for phase 2 funding? This is when we get often. So you do not need to have completed your phase 1 award. You don't have to be past that project period to apply for phase 2. However, to be competitive for a phase 2, you should be able to come into that phase 2 application showing your results from phase 1 and showing success at meeting the goals of your phase 1. If you are kind of going ahead of schedule and you've gotten results and you're ready to apply, but you still have 2 months on your project period, that is fine. That does not need to hold you back from applying. Can I apply for phase 2 funding if I don't have a funded phase 1? Yes, you can. If you feel you're coming into the application stage with the equivalent of phase 1 feasibility data, you can apply through the direct to phase 2 mechanism. You do not need to have a phase 1 funded to apply for phase 2 funding. Phase 2B versus CRP. I'll spend a little bit of time on this because these are both mechanisms that are only available to companies that have a phase 2 award. There are some differences between these two. They're both about 2 to 3 years in length, and in one case, in the phase 2B case, up to $3 million total cost. In the CRP case, up to $3.36 million total cost. So pretty similar in terms of length and budget. The outsourcing is different. So in a phase 2B, you're going to have the same outsourcing restrictions that you have in a phase 2. You can outsource up to 50% of the work. In a CRP, there is not any limit on what can be outsourced. However, we typically expect that at least 10% is going to the small business. You can also have an award, a CRP award that entirely goes to the small business, so that's fine, but there is that flexibility in outsourcing available in CRP that is not available in other mechanisms. There's also a difference in scope. Phase 2B is going to be the same kind of research and development scope or restrictions for those direct funds that you have in phase 2. CRP is going to allow a lot more flexibility in how those funds are utilized. They can be utilized for other kinds of technical assistance and later stage R&D activities, such as scale-up manufacturing, synthesis, process optimization, clinical studies and trials. There's a whole list of additional activities. If you take a look at the CRP funding announcement or the description of the website description of the CRP program that's available on the main NIH SBIR website, you'll see some of the broad range of activities that can be supported through CRP. And finally, to close out this section, clinical trial FAQs. So one important aspect is determining whether or not your research qualifies as a clinical trial under the NIH definition. So it's not the case that all human subjects research will qualify as a clinical trial. It's also not the case that you need a very traditional controlled group randomized control clinical trial to be qualified as a clinical trial under the NIH definition. The guidance on what a clinical trial is to the NIH is available on the website linked here. There's also a very nice clinical trial decision tool that I highly recommend you walk through if you are proposing human subjects research, so you can really determine whether or not you are going to be under the clinical trial umbrella at NIH. This is very important to identify before you apply, because as you saw in that slide of funding opportunities, many funding opportunities are broken down by being either clinical trial required or no clinical trials allowed. This is because there are often different review criteria with those funding opportunities. So really important to know before you apply whether you're going to be considered a clinical trial, as that will affect what funding opportunities are available to you. And if you apply to a non-clinical trial funding opportunity and you have a clinical trial, you do risk having that application being withdrawn and having to wait another cycle to reapply. Do clinical trial FOAs have specific requirements? They often can. It's important to read through those funding opportunities very closely. In particular, at NINDS, our clinical trial funding opportunities require that applicants have, at the time of submission, either an IDE approved, an IND approved, or an IRB designation of non-significant risk. That's needed at the time of application. Again, if you don't have that, you do risk being withdrawn from the your application being withdrawn. If you have questions about that, that's absolutely something to contact us about so that we can help to confirm whether you have clinical trial and whether you have the requirements to be able to apply. Do I need to have IRB or IACUC approval at the time of application? An IACUC kind of goes beyond the clinical trial realm, but no, often no, it's not necessary to have IRB or IACUC approval for your application at the time of application, but you should check the specific FOA, make sure that's true in your specific case. And then note that it may be the case that if your IRB approval is not in place at the time of award, your funding may be restricted until that IRB is approved. There's a link on this page as well to additional clinical trial guidance from the NIH, which again, I highly recommend reading if you're proposing any human subject research. The NINDS Division of Translational Research also has a number of cooperative agreement funding opportunities, which have a mechanism code of U44. What's the difference here? Okay, these are dedicated cooperative agreements. They have their milestone awards. So every year there's specific milestones you need to meet, but they do allow you to be, you're part of a bigger program outside of just small business that is devoted to developing or translating specific technologies. These programs often provide you with access to resources like contract CRO support, consultants. So there can be advantages to having this additional guidance and resources as part of this program. There are a number of different ones that you can apply to in these small business specific tracks or U44s. In devices, there's the Translational Neural Devices U44, as well as a Brain Initiative U44. For small molecules, you can look at the Blueprint Neurotherapeutics U44 opportunity. If you're working in the biologic space, you can look at the Create Bio U44s. And if you're working on biomarker development, you can take a look at the biomarker U44 as well. If you are working in this space and you're interested, I highly recommend taking a look at the website. And if you would like to see if you're a good fit, contact the program officer affiliated with those programs. Again, those tracks kind of are managed under a bigger umbrella of these translational programs, and you will get feedback as to whether your project is sort of ready at a readiness stage that's appropriate for these funding opportunities. If it is not, if you get feedback that, you know, what you're doing is really interesting, but you're not quite ready, you can utilize SBIR and STTR grant funding to do work to get you in a place where you might be competitive in these programs. So please take a look at these programs to learn more. In addition, there are clinical trial networks available for small businesses to utilize through these, the NeuroNext U44 and StrokeNet U44 funding opportunities. So if you are pursuing a clinical trial and you're interested in utilizing an NIH clinical trial network, please take a look and contact the program officials associated with those programs to learn more. The next stage is going to be making sure that your project fits into SBIR, to NINDS, SBIR and STTR budget and timeline guidance. At NINDS, like many institutes, we have a number of pre-approved waiver topics that if your project fits into those topics, you can go ahead and request a budget that exceeds the Small Business Administration hard cap. The hard cap for phase 1 from the Small Business Administration is about $256,000 total cost. At NINDS, if your project fits into one of these waiver topics, you can request up to $700,000 in total cost with no more than $500,000 per year. Your phase 1 can be anywhere from 6 to 24 months at NINDS. For phase 2, the Small Business Administration's hard cap is about $1.68 million in total cost. Again, under a waiver, you can request up to $3 million in total cost with no more than $1.5 million per year, and projects can be 2 to 3 years in duration. Important to note that SBIR funding can never be used to support foreign work, including foreign-based consulting services, or to purchase foreign sourced materials. There are rare exceptions to that. I realize I just said never. There are rare exceptions to that, but it's very rare that those exceptions are granted, and please contact us if you think you will require utilizing foreign work. Some of the frequently asked questions we get for budget. How do I utilize these waivers? Do I need program to email approval that I include in my application? You do not. Your waiver applicability should initially be determined by you, the applicant. As you saw from the previous slide, the topics are fairly straightforward. They're things like in vivo animal research. It's going to be fairly straightforward to see if your project is relevant to those topics. Because we do not see your full application before you apply, we cannot guarantee that you will fit into a waiver topic. We will confirm that after the full application has been submitted. As long as you are requesting a budget in line with NINDS guidance, you do not need any form of prior program approval. In your application, you can simply request that additional budget in your application. You do not need to have any sort of waiver or program approval cited. Company indirect rates. So we get a question a lot of times, especially from new applicants, about how large your indirect rate can be at a small business. If your company has not negotiated an indirect rate directly with the government, you are allowed to request up to 40% for an indirect rate. You are also allowed to request additionally up to 7% in fee. This is considered a company profit, this fee. You don't have the same restrictions on utilizing those funds as you do for direct or even indirect funding. So that fee can be used to, for instance, pay for foreign consultants, pay for IP related costs, and do other essential work for your business that can't be covered under the direct funding or the indirect funding. Next, it's time to contact us. We're going to want to see a draft specific aims page. You can find examples of specific aims pages in the sample applications. These usually have a nice little intro to what you're doing, why you're doing it, where you are now, and then it will lay out what you plan to do in the project. And that's incredibly important for us to look at, for us to be able to determine whether this project is indeed at the right place at NINDS, whether you are targeting the right funding opportunity and the right mechanism. So we'll really want to see that specifically. We will respond. We can let you know that NINDS is the right place to go. We can confirm whether you're targeting the right funding opportunity. If we're not the right place, we can direct you to another IC or a different program officer at NINDS. And we ask that you please include any specific questions that you have for us in your email so that we can efficiently get back to you with answers. As a note, direction or information we cannot give to you, we cannot provide technical direction or intellectual contribution to your project, so we can't tell you what to do. But we can help you to determine if this is what you want to do, this is the right place to take it. We do recommend that you are contacting us with your specific aims page and questions at least 1 to 2 months prior to the due date. That is because our inboxes and our calendars start getting very filled up as we lead up to a due date. If we see that you have specific questions that we think really are going to require a call, we want to make sure there's enough time to actually get that call on our calendars before you have to submit. Finally, it's time to write your full application. Some tips: please pay attention to the rigor of your both your preliminary data and the activities you're proposing. There are several resources that we have available to let you know what we mean by rigor and what you should be thinking about in your application. Make sure that you're building a strong team. This is often a potential area of weakness, especially for new companies coming in. You need to not only have excellent technical expertise, but be thinking about, do you also have the right business development expertise, the right clinical expertise? Are you working with partners and groups that are highly experienced in what you're asking them to do? These are all going to be things that reviewers look at when they're evaluating the strength of the team. If you have gaps in your team, you can think about adding them on, either in the form of consultants, or as bringing on new sub-awardees, bringing on new investigators, or even staff into your company. Utilize letters of support whenever you can. It is helpful to have these from your collaborators in particular. So if you have a consultant that you're planning on utilizing, having a letter of support from that consultant stating that they are committing to what you're saying that they will do is important. In addition, having letters of support from potential or existing partners. So if you have a funder already, if you have a potential partner, someone who's interested in potentially licensing your product, that is a great thing to include. And also include letters of support from potential customers or key opinion leaders. So people who say, like, this is really going to make a difference in this field. Those can also be helpful to include. Be cautious about including links in your application. We recently spoke with people from the Center of Scientific Review, and they say they're seeing more and more applications being withdrawn because people aren't following the guidance about hyperlinks. And the danger there is that if you're not following very specifically the guidance and policies about including hyperlinks, then your application can be withdrawn because it seems like you are overstuffing or putting more information or content in your application than is allowed, right? You've effectively expanded a 6-page research section into now, however many pages are on your company website. So avoid, if at all possible, if you really want to include links, make sure you're looking at this notice that's linked here and following all that guidance. And then finally, we advise you to use the PHS assignment form. You can utilize this to identify specific expertise that you want in assigned reviewers, to request a specific scientific review group if you would like to do so. You do not need to do that. If you want to identify any reviewers that might be in conflict of interest, or if you want to request a specific institute to have assignment of your application. Again, it's possible that that those will not be honored if it's felt like there really are better review groups or better institutes to fit your project, but you can at least make the suggestions, and if they do fit, they are usually honored. In addition, here I'm linking to the Open Mic blog. This is from Mike Lauer in the Office of Extramural Research. A lot of really interesting and important tips and information on policies available there. Finally, it's time to apply. So you can actually apply through Assist or grants.gov. There is information within the funding opportunity announcement you're applying to on how to apply. Some of the resources to help you prepare for this process include the application guide, the annotated form set specific for SBIR and STTR, and then of course, as I mentioned before, the ERA service desk, which can help if you have any issues in the mechanics of applying. If all of this, if you're a new company to NIH, you have not received funding, SBIR, STTR funding from NIH before, and all this seems very overwhelming, highly advise you to take a look at the Applicant Assistance Program. This program is open to any company that has not received NIH, SBIR, or STTR funding. It's okay if you've received it from NSF or DoD. It's okay if you've applied before, but you have not received funding. This is intended for applicants that have little NIH grant writing experience, limited networks, and sparse access to support. Diverse applicants are highly encouraged to apply to this program. There are several participating institutes that are listed here, Each of us has a certain number of slots in the program, so we do ask that you apply to the program. The application portal to participate in this program will be open in December, very early in December, for companies that intend to develop a phase 1 proposal for the April 5th submission. So for those of you who aren't sure yet, you're on the fence of if you're going to apply in January or April, you may want to consider applying to this program and planning and having this coaching expertise to help you put together a strong application for the April deadline instead of rushing to do something in January. More information is on the website available here. Women-owned and disadvantaged small business FAQs. The definitions are available here. The SBIR and STTR program overall highly encourages participation of women-owned and disadvantaged small businesses in SBIR and STTR funding opportunities. To become recognized, you have to go through a self-certification process. For your awareness, your status as a woman-owned or disadvantaged small business is not visible to reviewers in your application. Finally, I'm going to go over the review process. The timeline for the time you apply to the council meeting is shown up here. So review is happening during that period. During that period, we as program staff are really not going to be communicating with you very much unless we reach out for clarification of things. We can't update you on the likelihood of funding. We can't update you on the status or how it's looking or what range we're funding. We really won't be able to say much until funding recommendations have been made after the NINDS Council meets. You will first go to peer review. Your priority score will be released shortly after the meeting. You will get your summary statement, which is going to be a written comments from the reviewers, as well as if your application was discussed at the meeting, you'll get a summary of what the discussion was, which will indicate the score driving strengths and weaknesses of your project. And then finally, the funding plan or funding recommendations from program will go to the NINDS Council meeting. And ultimately, the director will approve funding recommendations and they'll be released and you'll be notified shortly after the council meeting. I highly recommend if you are at all new or even if not to the application process, attending this upcoming webinar that's being hosted by a number of institutes in the SEED Small Business Office. That is going to be on Tuesday, November 10th on understanding the NIH peer review process. They're going to go into a lot more detail on these specific aspects. In addition, I've linked some guidance that will help you understand more about the scoring process and the overall review process, as well as advice for SBIR and STTR that comes from the Center for Scientific Review. These are the standard SBIR and STTR review criteria. So these are the terms in which you should think about your project. Are you showing that the product is addressing an important problem and has commercial potential? Is there a realistic market for it? For the approach, are you proposing a rigorous design and using methods that are well developed and appropriate? Are there potential pitfalls identified and alternative approaches provided? For innovation, how novel is your technology or product? And does the product fill a significant market gap in an innovative way? For investigators, does your team have the appropriate training and expertise to complete the project and bring the product to market? Environment, is there a scientific environment that contributes to the probability of success? Do you have appropriate facilities and equipment? And then the commercialization side, if you do have a commercialization plan required, so not phase ones, does your company's business strategy have a high potential for success? So these are things you should be thinking about as you put your application together, as they will be the criteria upon which your project is weighed. Some of the FAQs we get: how do I request a specific study section? You mentioned the PHS assignment form. I will note that SROs work really hard, SROs being scientific review officers who run the review meetings and assign reviewers, work really hard to make sure that the appropriate expertise in the reviewers matches your application. Sometimes that is weighed above and beyond what the sort of name of the group is, and expertise does fluctuate across the different review panel groups. So if you don't go to the review section that you requested, it may be because there were really more appropriate expertise in the reviewers of a different panel. If you have questions or concerns about your assignment, those really can go directly to the Center for Scientific Review. Again, we don't play a role in the assignment of your application, and we can't do any actions to change your reviewers or your study section assignment. If you've resubmitted, will you have the same reviewers? Not necessarily reviewers. If you're interested in acting as a reviewer, you're welcome to contact us and we can give you more information. And what we can tell you as far as the review discussion, really nothing outside the summary statement. We can't give you additional insight into things that came up in the review discussion. We certainly can't tell you anything about the reviewers themselves. So we're really limited to discussing the summary statement. The award process is what's going to happen after review. As a note, we do not have a set pay line. NINDS limits consideration of applications to a zone of scores, and within that zone, applications are further evaluated for funding recommendations based on a combination of factors and in accordance with our priority statement. Our priority statement lists the bulleted items as being priorities for our program. All of those are factored into funding recommendations that are going to be reviewed by the National Advisory Neurological Disorder and Stroke Council, and of course, ultimately approved by the NINDS director. Questions we often get about funding decisions. I received a funding recommendation after council. Am I going to get an award? This is not a recommendation is not an indication of funding. It does mean we are moving forward in that process, but there are things that happen in the due diligence between a recommendation for funding and award that can prevent an award from being made. Your notice of award, which is typically issued 1 to 2 months following a funding recommendation, is going to be the guarantee of funding. When will I find out my funding recommendation? Again, this is typically about a couple of weeks after the council meeting. You can view information of when those meetings are publicly on the website. What if my small business loses eligibility prior to a notice of award? This does happen. Companies, for instance, get acquired or merge with larger companies that make them now ineligible to receive that award. You do need to sign a certification of eligibility before you receive the award. And so if you lose your eligibility and you cannot certify that you are eligible, you will need to forfeit that award. What % of SBIR and STTR applications are funded? The success rates are published on the main NIH SBIR website. They are published by year and broken out by mechanism. Roughly about 20% of phase 1 applications and about 40% of phase 2 applications are funded. Our institute tends to track very closely to the NIH-wide averages. Resubmission, if you weren't funded on the first try, what do? Carefully review critiques that come up in your summary statement. Make sure you utilize those reviewer comments to improve your application. Assume where if they say something wasn't there and it was there, take that as an indicator that maybe it wasn't explained well enough or needs to be more carefully explained or in a different, more prominent location, right? Take this as signs that, okay, maybe we need to make that more clear. If you have really constructive feedback from reviewers that helps you to improve and oh, I never thought of that, that is a good idea, take it to heart and go ahead and make changes to what you're planning to do based on that reviewer feedback. You're then going to revise and resubmit your application. You'll have an additional introductory page in your resubmission that will allow you to respond to reviewer critiques. We highly recommend your tone is constructive, not defensive. And in general, it's not always the case, but generally speaking, the % likelihood of resubmissions tends to be higher than first-time applications. So resubmission typically helps you, not always, but often it will, especially if you take those reviewer comments to heart and try to improve your application based on the feedback. And finally, take advantage of available resources. If you are eligible for AAP, we highly recommend maybe this is a time to not race to reapply, but really step back, go through the AAP program, have a coach help you address some of those comments, or at least to help you with building your application, and then reapply after going through that process. Frequently asked questions on resubmission. How many times can I reapply? You can resubmit an application one time. After that, depending on the mechanism, you may be able to submit the same project as a new application. Can you switch between SBIR and STTR mechanisms? Yes, you can. You can also often switch between funding opportunity announcements, but there are sometimes caveats to this, so it's important to read the details of your funding opportunity announcements to make sure this is allowable. My phase 2 resubmission was not funded. Can I resubmit as a phase 2 again? So this is one of those catches. So some mechanisms require, so a phase 2 requires that you are, you've had a phase 1 that you've been successful with, and now you're coming in for that phase 2 application. Once you've resubmitted that phase 2, if you are not funded, you'll need to reapply as a direct to phase 2. So that project will no longer be affiliated with the same project number as your phase 1, but it is possible. This is a new change. So now it is possible to come in as a direct to phase 2 with preliminary data that was funded by a phase 1, but is not necessarily tied to that project. And finally, this is just our contact information. You can reach out to us at our main email address to get all of us at once. You should, I absolutely recommend signing up for our listservs, both the Division of Translational Research listserv and the NIH SBIR and STTR listserv, as well as following both of those groups on Twitter. That's how we always message out to the community. In addition, we highly recommend taking a look at both our website, the NINDS Small Business Program website, and the SBIR NIH-wide website, as both of those are going to have important information to you. Okay, and that is what I have for the overall presentation, and we are now going to transition into Q&A. So Natalie, I'm surprised that that was so long. Hopefully we covered a lot of what people had to ask, but I'm going to hand over to you to, I know you've been going through questions that we've gotten, so
yeah, definitely
feel free.
And thank you to everybody who has submitted questions so far, submitted questions early. If we don't get to your questions, you know, we will do our best to get through as many as possible. But don't despair if we didn't get to your question. We will be distributing the slides to everybody that registered afterwards. So everybody will get a copy of the slides, and which will include our contact information. So you can contact us if your question didn't get answered. We are also going to be posting the slides to our website as well. So if you have a friend who wasn't able to join, you know, you'll be able to point them there. So I do want to make sure that I first answer some of the questions that were posed when people were registering. Good job to those people. And there was a couple questions actually all related to device development, and in terms of, you know, what's the earliest kind of device development we accept, what kind of funding opportunities are there for device companies, maybe those in the clinical trial space, and sort of, and also kind of what's a typical device proposal for a phase 1?
Sure, yeah, so as I mentioned, our program will support a really wide range of activities. In devices, this might look like everything from developing the prototype and doing some initial validation of that prototype in a phase 1. I would say that tends to be typical, that a phase 1 ends with some kind of validation, either in a phantom or in vivo if appropriate. It really is going to depend on your specific technology as to what an appropriate demonstration of feasibility will be. There are some cases, as we know, where there are great phantoms that exist, or great benchtop tests that you can do in de-risking your technology. In other cases, not so much, and in vivo may be necessary. So really, it's important to think about what are the high-risk aspects of this particular device, and show that that's what you're choosing to de-risk in your phase 1 and how you're choosing to do that. As I mentioned, it is possible we see applications come in where that prototype is being built in phase one. We see other phase ones come in where a prototype has already been built, but there's going to be some initial testing or validation or optimization or usability study that's going to occur in phase one. If you're not coming in, if you're with a device made, if you're coming in from nothing and proposing to build a device, you do want, now, as we talked about, preliminary data is not required for phase one, but you do want to make sure that you're providing a clear premise for why this approach is going to work for the indication you're proposing and why your specific technology is an advantage over competitors, right? So it's not necessary to have preliminary data, but it is necessary to have a strong premise. So if you don't have preliminary data, you want to make sure you're providing some really strong evidence for why you think this is going to work. But hopefully that helps with the scope of phase one. As far as the clinical trials, so as I mentioned, we do support clinical trials in early stage clinical trials. So it's appropriate to, if you have a device, whether it's an implantable device that's going to require an IDE or a non-significant risk device like a wearable, we allow both of those in our clinical trial FOA. Again, there's going to be a requirement that you either have that IDE approved or have an IRB designate the study as non-significant risk for the project you're applying for at the time of application.
And I think it'd also be worth noting that those exploratory clinical trial funding opportunities are only for fast track, direct to phase two or regular phase two application. So unfortunately, you can't just have a phase one application for that funding opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Natalie.
Great. There was a question about developing a organoid disease model, and maybe this also can get to a question that we sometimes do see disease models, assay development, and a lot of people see the Ignite funding opportunities and think they should go to that. Can you kind of speak to, like, if you're in that sort of space, what should you apply to?
Yeah, absolutely. So anything that is going to be fundable by Ignite, if you're looking at Ignite and you think this is for me, but you're a small business, you come to us so you can utilize the set aside. We can likely fund the same scope of activities that would be under Ignite, under small business SBIR and STTR opportunities, either through the omnibus, or if it's a research tool that you're developing, it's primarily going to be used for neuroscience research, may be applicable to the brain funding opportunity that is for research tool development. So certainly we would advise you to come look at this small business set aside funding. If you qualify for it, we can fund things like assay development, disease models, and other research tools that you would look at Ignite to do.
Great. There was a question specifically about our AD/ADRD funding opportunity, and if you don't mind, Emily, I'll just jump in and answer that one because I'm the program contact on that, and they were asking, they thought that it was just NIA. Actually, NINDS did join that funding opportunity, SBIR, STTR, AD/ADRD funding opportunity. We joined it last year. So NIA and NINDS have shared interests in AD/ADRD. We are the lead for, if you are looking at vascular contributions to cognitive impairment dementia, that comes to us. Lewy body dementia, that comes to us. Frontotemporal dementia comes to us. Whereas NIA is the lead, honestly, for most things in the Alzheimer's disease space. And certainly if you're in the clinical trial space for Alzheimer's disease, that would be for NIA. But there actually is there's a little notice. I can totally understand people don't see it, but there's a little notice with that PAS that signs us on and explains kind of our differences in mission. So we got a couple questions regarding patents, and do you need to have a patent to do a phase one proposal?
No, not necessarily. So for IP, what you should be thinking about in phase one is will I need to have this IP protected through a patent to be successful commercially, right? And if the answer is yes, we're going to need to patent this to go to market, then hopefully you can provide some brief information about the status of that and the plan of how you're going to go forward. So this might be like, we have a provisional patent, we put in a provisional patent, or we're working with our the tech transfer office on this project. Acknowledge that you know it needs to have a patent to be commercialized and what your status is in that process. It's not going to be an expectation that at a phase 1 level you have a patent. In most cases, I will always caveat that there might be specific cases where there would, that a patent may be required, but that I can't think of examples where that's the case right now. So you want to address it. I will say you don't have a commercialization plan in phase 1, right? So you're not going to have a significant amount of space to detail to anything related to the commercialization plan, but it is appropriate in your significance section to be touching on points that are related to the commercializability of the product, and IP may be one of those factors.
Yeah, and as a quick clarification, yeah, you don't want to try to attach a commercialization plan for a phase 1. That would be something that would be that would get you withdrawn. So don't do that. There was also kind of related to that a question about, can you use indirect funds for filing a patent?
I do not believe so. There is guidance available online that clearly states out what is allowable as a direct cost, what is allowable as an indirect cost. My understanding is that the best funding source for patent-related activities is going to be your fee, which you are allowed to request. There's, you can add 7% on top of your direct and indirect costs combined and utilize that as fee for your business, which can be utilized however your business sees fit.
Great. Got a couple questions about phase 2B CRPs. And one question was, do we have a matching requirement for our phase 2B?
That is a great question. It is not a requirement, but it is very much recommended. And I believe we state in there that that there's prioritization. Is that right, Natalie? You'd know better than me, that there's prioritization for applications that do come in with matching funding, but it is not explicitly required. So take a look at that guidance. The reason for having that is because we like, there's two factors. One, we like to see that there's been some additional due diligence or some additional, someone else who said this is really a good idea and is putting money into it. So we like to see that at this stage in the game. It also shows us that there might be, phase 2B is really the kind of end of the road of NIH funding, right? At that point, it should transition either out to the market or on to the next stage of development where it's getting picked up by third-party funding. So we want to see that there's some promise of that happening. The other thing I'll mention for this matters for both phase 2B and CRP funding, there should be a reason why NIH grant type support is needed for those mechanisms, right? If you are working in an area where it's really hot in investment, I don't know, pick telehealth or something that, right now people are investing at fairly early stages. We want to hear why you need additional support past a phase 2 to get, to kind of get through that valley of death to a point where investors are going to meet up and fund you, right? So there could be many reasons for that, but we want to make sure we understand, why do you need government grant funding at that stage?
There was another question about how many phase 2Bs do we fund every year? How many CRPs do we fund every year?
Yeah, we don't have a quota. We don't set, we're going to fund 2 CRPs or anything like that. We get what we get. We get scores based on the merit of those proposals. We have funds available, and we really look to all of those priority statement factors that you saw to make decisions about what to fund. So I don't really have an average. I think that the NIH data that's published may include numbers across NIH of what's published, but it really varies with us, and we don't have a quota to fill. Similarly, I didn't add this to FAQs, but I should have. We don't have a quota on, say, the number of stroke grants, the number of epilepsy grants. We don't kind of put them in the piles and make sure that that is a certain way. So we're going to look at everything that comes into our mission. Score is definitely one of the factors in it, but we're going to look across that prioritization statement at everything that comes in.
Great. Our next questions are related to foreign involvement. And the first one is, can an STTR have a foreign university collaborator?
Unfortunately, no. So it has to, the collaborator in an STTR has to be a US-based institution. A foreign-based institution would not be viable for an STTR mechanism.
And then there was another question about using CROs outside the US for conducting, late stage IND enabling studies. Would this be allowable?
Almost certainly it would not be, but I'm caveating that because there are pathways to look at getting a waiver, which would allow you to have work that's conducted outside of the US supported under an SBIR. It's a very high bar, and at a minimum, you would need to show that that work, one, cannot be done in the US at any cost, so that just the fact that it's less expensive is not a valid reason to get a waiver. Two, that work is absolutely crucial to your development. There'd be no other way to get your product commercialized without doing that work. And I can't remember the third one, but those two are pretty big. So if you think it's the case that you absolutely have to have an individual located or an organization located outside the US be doing the work in a foreign location, that includes consultants, that's absolutely essential to your project, you can contact us to see if there's a viable pathway to a waiver there. I will say it's a very high bar. So when possible, for instance, in the case of foreign consultants, this comes up a lot. We often will advise use your fee for that. If you have someone who's located in the UK or in Canada, wherever, who you think is really important to keep them on the team and you want to support them, use your fee for that. You can use your fee however you want. That doesn't work when it's really larger cost items like a CRO contract, but it does work in the case of consulting. You can also bring in other funds. So we do have cases where someone wants to work with a foreign-based CRO, and they do have some seed funding from somewhere else, and so they kind of utilize the seed funding to fund that portion of it, and then use SBIR funds to fund the work that's in the US. So think about other sources of funding you could use. Think about ways to do it in the US so you can have SBIR funded. If none of that works, you can come to us and we can definitely discuss whether we think a waiver is a viable path.
Great. We got another question about, say you came in, you're doing, say, a small molecule, you had a lead compound that you thought was pretty good, but then you got a better lead compound later on. You found out maybe there was liabilities. Can you, change tactics, change compounds along the way?
Contact us. It really can depend. Contact us if it looks like things are changing. So if it's the case that you're finishing, that you thought you'd have a certain target and look different, and then you're going to come in for phase 2 funding, there's probably no issue. If you want to change the course of the research that you're proposing doing and you're funded to do, really important to come talk to us so that we can make sure that change is something we work through and get approval for before you end up submitting a report that shows you've done work that's completely outside of the scope of what you're doing. So yeah, if it's something like, the results were not you thought of, and now you're going to go in for a phase 2 on a different molecule, you had a first target in your phase 1, and now you're kind of shifting, that may be fine. Again, you might want to talk with us about like, okay, I was kind of going this way and now I'm going this way. This happens with indications sometime. I was really looking at, I don't know, a certain neurogenetic disorder. Now I'm thinking this might be good for MS. We can discuss whether and how it would make sense within those mechanisms. But if you are going to be changing or thinking of changing the scope of what you were funded to do, definitely talk to your program officer about that so we can make sure you get a thumbs up and you're doing everything so you don't get in trouble later on when you send in your final report.
Great. There was a question about letters of support, and maybe you can just kind of in general kind of speak to what makes a good letter of support. In particular, this person was asking if a letter from a VC investor is a helpful thing to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll speak to funders specifically. So we recognize that, a VC funder may not say like, yes, I'm definitely, if you meet these milestones, I am absolutely handing over a check. But they, they may be able to at least reflect interest, or they may be able to reflect what they do want to see before they're going to really get serious with you. Those are incredibly helpful. That tells the reviewers and program staff that you have an interested party, that funding path is dependent upon you going in a certain direction, right? It can help to justify the activities you're proposing to do. So absolutely, if you're able to provide letters of support from actual funders or from potential funders, outside of funders, potential partners. So sometimes we see, large scale, biotech companies that say, hey, yeah, we're really interested in what you're doing. We want to see if you can get, get an IND or get past a phase 1. Those are absolutely helpful. And I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to try to get anything that you can show to support, just anything that you can have that shows there is third-party partnering interest will be an asset to your application and to your commercialization strength.
Right. There's another question when you were talking about putting hyperlinks and whether or not if there are URLs in your references.
Take them out. I
would say,
I read the notice, but I'm gonna just tell you, it's not worth getting withdrawn over. So I generally blanket advise, don't include hyperlinks, take them out. But yeah, go ahead, Nellie, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I would say, just read that notice carefully. There's really a very, very limited scope. And like Emily said, you don't want to get withdrawn because of that. There was a question about somebody who has maybe a therapeutic, like you mentioned in the beginning, that could be used for a lot of different things, or maybe they're a company that has a lot of projects that they're thinking about. Can they apply for multiple grants simultaneously, and one for every area of research?
Yeah, that's a great question. Technically, you can propose multiple simultaneous non-overlapping applications in a single cycle. We do not recommend it because, well, for a number of reasons. I mean, if they're in the same study section, you're gonna have two kind of projects from your company being reviewed. It's kind of confusing to reviewers. But more than that, we really want to see that you are focusing on a given indication, right? If your company's coming in and asking for 5 different projects, how do we know that your company is actually going to go forward and go through with a treatment for, I don't know, spinal cord injury or epilepsy, right? So I think it's really important that we want to see that your company is focusing on a first to market indication, that you're really committed to it, and that that you're serious about going to the endpoint. I think it would be it would be confusing if I guess you'd have to really be able to demonstrate that you have the resources and attention and team to be able to tackle multiple pathways simultaneously as a small business.
Great. There was another question about what is considered a disadvantaged business.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to pull it up again, but it's defined in the website that's linked there. So there is a very specific definition associated with it that is defined by the Small Business Administration, not by us at NINDS. And I would advise you to take a look at that website and read through the language, because I don't want to misspeak on the definition at this time. But you will get these slides, and there is a link that will provide that additional information to you.
Great. So there was a question about, could a new business apply? And I'm guessing, could the new business, this was when you were talking about AAP, so could a completely new business apply to AAP? Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah, you do have to be a formed business, so it has to have been a form. That doesn't mean you have to have gone through all those registrations I talked about, but it has to be an incorporated or otherwise business entity that exists. But yes, you do not need to have come in before. In fact, that's exactly why we developed at NIH. This program was developed, was to help businesses that have never gotten NIH funding get over what you now see as a huge amount of information and policy and procedure, and be successful in coming in to get grant funding through this mechanism.
Great. There was also a question sort of related to this of, we're women owned. What is, what is the benefit of certifying?
Sure. Yes. So, so it is something that we do pay attention to in our priority notice. You'll see that we very much encourage, the exact words, but we look at diversity of our portfolio coming in at women-owned and diverse and disadvantaged businesses as one of the factors we look at. Diversity is an important factor to our program. So it's helpful to us to know if we're funding. We do try to track that information as well. And that is how the Small Business Administration tracks how many women-owned businesses or disadvantaged-owned businesses are getting funding and participating in the program, is through that certification process. So yeah, that's how it can be helpful, but it is not required.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different initiatives. I mean, kind of AAP was sort of one that Emily described, other initiatives that the SBA is doing. And it's always a question of, do we have the data? Is it making a difference? And so having people actually certify helps us know if we are moving the needle at all. And just to clarify too, for those who are interested in the AAP, the portal opens, it appears like it opens on November 12th through, it'll be open to December 10th.
Oh, great.
Just so you are
That's
aware.
fantastic.
Yeah, and there will actually be...
I'll correct the website, the slide on that as well before we distribute. So that's great to know it's going to open earlier. Thank you.
And actually that corresponds, that November 12th date corresponds to another webinar that will be on the AAP program. So more details about what it's about, what you get from it, what you don't get from that, and all sorts of things. There was a question about software grants, and I think that the question was, how many of those do we fund? Is it part of our portfolio? Is it something that we're interested in, software in general?
Yeah, so as long as it's serving, neurological indications. So as a for instance, areas where we've seen applications come in the space have been things like neurosurgical mapping software or registration of different types of imaging. We've seen them come in the research tool space. So software that's going to help with neuroscience research or drug discovery. So absolutely, those do come into us. I don't know the percentage that is actively funded. Again, we don't have quotas for different types of modalities or indications. So we'd be looking to see, was it meritorious? Is it fitting all those review criteria? How does it look in our priority, as far as our priorities that are in our notice? And that's what we'll be utilizing to determine whether or not it'd be recommended for funding. So it's not how many are already funded doesn't really affect what our funding would be in the future. As long as it's in our mission, we'll look at it equally with everything else.
Great. There was another question about, what if we submit the same project scope to different grants, say the exploratory clinical trial announcement and the translational device announcement? What happen? Would it?
Yeah. So that one you can't do. So you can't have overlapping scope in two applications that are under review at the same time. What you can do, you can pick which one you think is going to be best, and you should talk to the program officers affiliated with those programs beforehand to get feedback on which mechanism would be right for you. I just had a call with someone, discussing whether our exploratory grants or the NeuroNext opportunity would be right. So we talked through that and figured out which one was the best fit and had them applied there. Now, you can, if you're not successful there, if you get feedback from reviewers that says, you're too early for this, or this isn't quite, you can say, okay, well, we think we actually want to go back and reapply. We're going to go to a devices U44 this time. We can give you feedback on that, make recommendations, but you cannot have overlapping scope in two different applications, even to different funding opportunities, different mechanisms from the same applicant. So you have to wait until you've gone through the review process with one application before you would go to try a different mechanism.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but review under review is up to the time where you get your summary statement.
Thank you. Yes, once you've received your summary statement, it is fair game for you to go and reapply with that same project in a different instantiation and or a different funding opportunity.
Great. All right. So we're going to go to the last question here.
Okay.
Perfect timing,
Great
I
timing.
think. And it's a question about review. Are SBIR, STTR grants reviewed in the same study sections as academic grants such as K or R grants?
This is a great question. So no, so small business grants are reviewed centrally at the Center for Scientific Review in specific special emphasis panels. I'm sure that the webinar that's coming up next week is going to go through a lot more detail into exactly what these panels are, but there are many of them. They are everything that comes into NIH that's in SBIR and STTR is going to go to these panels. There's several of them. They're broken by area. So it is not the case that NINDS SBIR grants all get reviewed together. In fact, they're distributed, whether they're doing therapeutics development, device development, assay development, software, rehab. They're going to go to pools of expertise that are most appropriate to those projects. They're going to be reviewed with other small business grants. And they're going to be reviewed by a panel of reviewers that consists of translational research expertise, business expertise, clinical expertise that is specifically built to review small business grants.
And with that, we are perfectly out of time.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad that we got to everyone's questions today. It sounds like this is the right amount of time. I'm very happy to take feedback. We hope to do more of these webinars. So if you as an attendee have any feedback on how we should change content or style, we are happy to take that feedback from you. Please feel free to send it. We will hopefully be following up with getting these slides out. I'll make those few changes on the AAP program so that's accurate and more informative, and hopefully we'll get those out by tomorrow to those of you who registered. And again, feel free to contact us with any additional questions. We hope all of you apply and do wonderful in review. And a final plug to, again, if you're not very familiar with this process, definitely recommend looking at attending that review webinar and considering the AAP program.
All right, and with that, we will conclude. And thank you again, everybody, for your time. And thank you, Emily.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thanks for the great questions. And thank you to the team for joining today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.